our very own Nobel Laureate, Ms. Gbowee, here. I'm so pleased to have you once again, if I may say, in the halls of SIPA. For those of you who may not know, Ms. Gbowee is the 2011 Nobel Prize laureate. She is a peace activist, she's a trained social worker, and a women's rights advocate. And I think it's important to stress all of these because her hallmark in addressing the issue of peace is to address it from the needs of the people through the voices of the people, and in particular through the mobilization of women. And that really is very, very striking and singular. We've had many women peace laureates. They're all extraordinary people. But Ms. Gbowee has really brought a different method and a different approach. And we're so grateful that she has brought that to the world and to the Earth Institute and therefore to Columbia University, where she is the executive director of the Women, Peace and Security Program. And I want to welcome also Michaela Luttrell-Rowland, whom I've known, I think, since the inception of this program and who has helped to grow it into a really formidable force for change here. Ms. Gbowee led the Women of Liberia Mass Action for Peace. She has a distinction that will happen to few of us in our lives, which is to actually make a difference in a war. She has the particular distinction of having helped to bring peace. And she is now, I believe, engaged in bringing her techniques, her vision, her way of doing things to many other parts of the world. She was telling me that she's leaving for another trip tomorrow. And before that, she will be addressing the Security Council at the United Nations. So she is the, just to be very quick in a long list of accomplishments, her experience in ending the Liberia Civil War was chronicled in her memoir, Mighty Be Our Powers, and in the documentary, Pray the Devil Back to Hell, which if you happen not to have seen, you really should see. It's a lacuna in your educations if you haven't seen it. She's the founder and current president of the Gbowee Peace Foundation Africa, the founding head of the Liberia Reconciliation Initiative, and the co-founder and former executive director of the Women, Peace and Security Network in Africa. She is also a founding member and former Liberian coordinator of Women in Peacebuilding Network, West Africa Network for Peacebuilding. Ms. Gbowee advises numerous organizations working for peace, women's rights, and youth and sustainable development, and she has held distinguished fellowships at Barnard and at Union Theological Seminary here at Columbia. In 2016, Ms. Gbowee was awarded the Lifetime Award Achievement Prize for Peace in Africa by the Millennium Excellence Foundation, and in 2017, she was selected by the UN Secretary General to serve as a member of the United Nations Secretary General's high-level advisory board on mediation. In 2018, she was appointed to the Gender Equality Advisory Council for Canada's G7 presidency. So without further ado, please help me to welcome Ms. Gbowee and
Yes. I'm really humbled and honored to have you here, Minister. Your predecessor, Margot, is a good friend and sister. We've had many moments of crazy feminist activism in different parts of the world. I look forward to working more with you. I'm really, really glad that we have this moment to have you here. I'm delighted to be hosting with SIPA and with our program here, the WPS program. This program is a new initiative, and I think it came out of my frustration of persistently working as an activist and being seen as a subject to research and not as an expert in my field. And so 6 or 7 years ago, I was in Cape Town with Professor Peter Coleman after winning the Nobel Peace Prize, and we're talking about peace building, activism, legacy. And I was just telling him about how I wished that one day we could merge activism with academia. He said, "Why? What is stopping you? Let's do this." It took us 5 years to research, and 2 years ago we launched this program. And I don't think that I've regretted, and I think every day we do the work that we do at the WPS program, I'm even more proud that we endeavor to do it. A few months ago in April, I was opportune to go to Cameroon, where they've been having 3 years of one of the bloodiest conflict in Africa. Something here dropped, I'm sorry. And the conversation in Cameroon moved from women in the field to sitting in the office of the foreign minister. I got to that meeting and I already knew that there was no feminist foreign policy there. There was no thinking of the impact of conflict on women's lives. There was no thinking of reimagining peace and security to include all of the different basic human security needs. I walked into the meeting, and of course, this is one African man to one African woman that he miscalculated. Sat next to him and he said, "So what do you have to tell me about peace? I'm sure you brought the UN recipe for peace, that we should go to the peace table." I mean, like his staff, my staff, and he went straight into attack mode. So I sat and listened to him, and afterwards I grabbed his hand and said, "You're from Central Africa, I'm from West Africa. Don't ever try to preempt a West African woman." So now 1, 2, 3, 4, every other person just leave the room. I want to talk to the minister by himself. His staff people were looking at him. I say, "You all should leave right now. It's not up to him. I'm saying leave." And everyone left the room, and we sat and talked about peace. The impact of the war on the Cameroonian women, the impact of the war on the girls, and the stories of women using leaves for sanitary pad, and babies' arms being hacked off. And his personal anger, because the moment I walked into his office, he had just gotten news that his sister had died. And his anger was that he would not be able to go to where the war is to bury his sister. But my point to him was that there's no way you can even try to position peace from the perspective of the UN or from the perspective of your government and say to me it's another women's thing. Because women are front and center and middle of every conversation that impacts our lives and by extension impacts peace and war. And today, Minister, I'm happy to have you here because I think this is exactly what our world needs. And this is what we're trying to do with our program at the Earth Institute, centering women, not just as women, but as the experts that they are, women at the community level who are doing great work, but bringing them into academia so that they're able to say, yes, there are all these research, but this is the practice. And I'm saying it because several years ago, I had the urge to go back to grad school because I didn't feel credentialed enough as an activist to be in this space at the UN and other spaces where people have done research and done. So I went to grad school, and every time they would give me one theory, I would tell myself that's exactly what I did in the field, but I didn't have a name for it. And so I think as we do this work, as you position yourself as a world leader and going back into spaces and saying to people that we need to have a feminist perspective of peace, a feminist perspective of justice, a feminist perspective of everything, you also need to consider, or I'm sure you already know, I'm preaching to the choir, that the women in these communities are the ones making it happen. So that you're here for us to have this conversation, I'm excited because this is the bridge that we've been hoping to build with this program. A few months back, our first cohort in Africa, we had a group of women from Kenya who were working on violent extremism, and the perspective that these women brought to the table about ending violent extremism is something that I've never read in any document at the UN. So as you go out, do your work as we do our work, I hope and pray that we can continue to have a kind of collaboration between our program, the WPS program, and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Sweden, because I think there's a great set of knowledge there. I want to thank you for coming. Thank you all for coming. I'm sure the next time we host you here, it will be in a bigger room, and we'll have a lot more individuals here. But these are the group of people that were destined to be here to listen to you talk about the fantastic policy. One final thing that I want to say is that when Canada invited me to serve on the G7, that was another moment where I felt like there is a need for grassroots activists to be in the room. I have a fun moment of disrupting the meeting, and the ambassador of Canada to France and Melinda Gates were chairing that meeting, and they were looking at me like, Lord Jesus, who brought her here? And Prime Minister Trudeau walked in the room after a few hours, and they said, Prime Minister, we interest you to note that you brought a troublemaker here. And he said, by troublemaker, you're referring to Leymah. And they nodded, and he said, that's exactly why I brought her on this committee, because I know that she will say the things that many other people will be too diplomatic to say. And that is the spirit of grassroots activism. Their expertise is not just from textbook, they live it, it impacts their life. The work that they do is their insurance policy. It's the insurance policy that their children live beyond 5, 6, 7, 10, 20, 25 years. And I know this because I live this. And I'm glad that I'm at this space and at this place now where I don't have to be political about peace and justice. I can speak feminism without being shy, and I'm glad to have you as an ally. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you very, very much. And I want to also thank and acknowledge that we are co-hosting this with the Women, Peace and Security Program, and without them it would certainly not have happened at all. So thank you really very, very much. It's also, I'm delighted just to have you here. And now it's also my great honor and pleasure to introduce Her Excellency, the Minister for Foreign Affairs of Sweden, Ms. Linde, who is here on a delegation, I believe, leading the delegation on a meeting to the United Nations. She's a recent nominee as Minister for Foreign Affairs. She was just appointed 2 months ago. And in this position, she succeeds Margot Lindström, whom we've met before and to whom Ms. Gbowee referred earlier. Previously, Ms. Linde served as Minister for Foreign Trade and Minister for Nordic Cooperation. Before that, she was the Minister for European Union Affairs and Trade for the Linde cabinet, following after May 2016. Throughout the 1990s, Minister Linde worked in government offices, including the Ministry's Secretary of Civil Affairs and as political advisor and the political advisor of the EU, and Trade Minister Mats Hellström of the Foreign Affairs, and Defense Minister Björn von Sydow of the Ministry of Defense. So she has an extensive and deep experience in foreign affairs, and I think that it's really wonderful that you lead a foreign policy that is named and imprinted as a feminist foreign policy, that you can bring the depths of experience as well as your personal and your country's commitment to realizing a new kind of foreign policy. Please, Minister.
Thank you very much, Professor Ergas and Madam Gbowee. Thank you for your fine words, students, friends, Actually, last time when I was here making a lecture in Columbia University, it was also with the Nobel Prize Laureate. It was Joseph Stiglitz. And as I was Minister of Trade, we talked about trade. And the room, which was much bigger than this, but it was also packed. So I was wondering if feminist foreign policy actually will attract so many listeners as trade policy. So I'm very happy that this room is full. So I think we can say that feminist foreign policy is as attractive as international trade. And I'm very happy to have the opportunity to speak here. And I will start with a poem. My 5 years darling on my knee, chattered and toyed and laughed with me. Now tell me, mother mine, quoth she, where you went in the afternoon. Allah, my pretty little life, I went to see a sorrowing wife who will be widowed soon. Perhaps some of you have heard these lines before. They were written in 1865 by Julia Ward Howe, New York-born poet, writer, and a strong women's rights advocate. In a way, this verse from her poem of the war captures some of the essence of the women, peace and security agenda, which we are discussing this week in the United Nations Security Council. And just like Leymah, I will also address the United Nations Security Council tomorrow. Women and men are affected by war and conflict in different ways. And we have to acknowledge this when we try to prevent and end the conflict. But I would actually go even further and say that women and girls are affected or suffer more from war and conflict. Because while everybody faces the trauma of deaths, bombings, violence and forced migration, women and girls are also the target of sexual violence. And during conflict and after conflict, they bear a different kind of responsibility of making life work in households, in families, in the community. So while men make decisions about war and peace, women carry the responsibility for making life work. They carry water, they carry food, they carry children, they carry on. I would like that to be the backdrop of our discussion today. My lecture on Swedish feminist foreign policy has two parts. First, I will describe how the Swedish government views developments in the world today with regard to gender equality and feminism. And second, I will talk about the conclusion we have drawn from our policy. Basically, what we can do to make the world more gender equal and how to make it a better place for everyone. Looking at the world today, I believe we can see a growing divide between two movements, or in the era of Instagram, we would describe it as a picture where the contrast just gets stronger and stronger. On the one hand, the bright spots are getting brighter. Some example. Sweden launched its feminist foreign policy 5 years ago. Now, Canada, France, Mexico has followed us, and we see strong interest from countries like Spain, Tunisia, New Zealand, perhaps even South Africa and elsewhere. Research institutes have been established to work in this area. The World Bank, the OECD, the United Nations system and others has shown a great interest. And when the Ethiopian Prime Minister and Nobel Peace Prize winner, Abiy, when the leader of a country of 100 million people appoints a government made up by 50% women, there is hope. Also, an important reminder in these times is that many figures are going in the right direction. For example, maternal death is decreasing and girls' access to education is increasing. But it is the contrast that is getting stronger, not the brightness setting, and unfortunately, at the same time, the shadows are getting darker. I would say that these shadows are personified by a movement which has been called a coalition of socially ultra-conservative governments, with the United States, Brazil, and Saudi Arabia at the helm. Their targets include women's sexual and reproductive health and rights. The right to abortion is at the center of this. Let me give you some example. When the Security Council adopted an important resolution on victims of sexual violence earlier this year, all language concerning sexual and reproductive health and rights was blocked. Those who blocked this, we should ask them, can you look these women in the eye, these victims of war rape, and say, no, you don't have the right to abortion. You do not have the right to emergency contraceptive. You do not have the right to sexual education or to know about your body, about HIV and AIDS. Because, ladies and gentlemen, this is where we are at. This is what the international community is telling these women. These leaders represent a movement that questions democracy, a right-wing extremist movement, a movement that is spreading. Because around the world, and not least in Europe, democracy is backsliding. Democracy is being threatened. And wherever these people come to power, the first thing they do is to target and restrict the rights of women. So when the shadows grow darker, what we can do if we believe that women should have the right to make their own decisions, that women's rights are human rights, and that gender equality makes the world a better place for all, what should we do? The first thing to do is to speak out, to say that we do not and will not accept efforts to undermine women's rights. This is what more and more countries and organizations are doing when they decide to implement feminist foreign policy, feminist diplomacy, and feminist development policy. Sweden's foreign policy means that a gender perspective is applied to everything we do. In all our political decisions, in all our activities, we ask, how does this affect gender equality? What are the gender implications of this action? What can we do to improve gender equality? That goes for me as a foreign minister, but also for every Swedish embassy in the world, for every ambassador, for every diplomat. And it means that Sweden has carried out thousands of activities, projects and events with the aim of promoting gender equality. We use the model with 3 R's to structure our thinking. That's rights, representation, and resources. So, for instance, do women have the same rights as men, legally, culturally, socially? Are women represented where decisions about them are made? In governments and parliaments, local assemblies, in the boards of companies? And the women and women's issue get the same resources, the same funding in budgets, in development cooperation. Right now, I have 3 priorities. The first is to stand up to this global movement of moral conservatism. In concrete terms, it means that Sweden has increased its funding for sexual and reproductive health and rights wherever the United States has withdrawn its support. It means that we have a strong focus on these issues in our development aid and in our bilateral development cooperation. So we support midwives, women's access to abortion, sexual education, and so on. And it's also about speaking out, about not keeping quiet when rights are violated. The second priority is a stronger focus on the social and economic conditions of girls and women around the world. So, for example, when our embassies plan projects and activities, They will study the country they are in to see what kind of discrimination women face in that country. Do they have the same access as men to the labor market, to education? Do they have the right to have a bank account, to inherit? What are the laws on prostitution, on violence? An important part of this is in our support to do the World Bank report, Women, Business and the Law, which I strongly recommend to those of you who are interested in these issues. Country by country, the report compares the rights of women and men and points out where discrimination exists. A stronger focus on the social and economic condition of girls and women also involves promoting universal childcare, parental leave, women's participation in the labor market, social and public health policy, and more. These are welfare policies, and Sweden knows from decades of experience that a system that promotes gender equality has a strong impact on economic growth and prosperity. The third priority is this: we want more to join our cause. We want more countries to adopt a feminist foreign policy and a feminist domestic policy. We want more organizations to realize the benefits of gender equality. We want more researchers and students to study gender equality. We want more journalists and writers and poets to write about gender equality. Ladies and gentlemen, you know, we can never talk about democracy, we can never talk about security, we can never talk about freedom if we ignore half the population. And for those who are not convinced that making life better for 3.5 billion people is the right thing to do, well, they might be convinced when they realize that the other 3.5 billion people will be better off as a result. It is as simple as that, and it is as hard as that. But what do you think? Now it's time for me to listen to you, and I'm very keen to hear both your thoughts and your views and your questions. Thank you very much.
So I know that the issues that the concern with the backlash is at the top of my agenda, and that it's very deeply felt amongst our students and amongst our faculty here, in particular with respect to gender rights, that all of the events that surrounded the Security Council resolution were astonishing and also enlightening in showing us the kinds of dynamics that we're facing. I'd like to start with just one question to you. There's a great deal of concern about the backlash, and before that already, there was a great deal of concern with the difficulty of translating states and international organizations' commitments in theory or in words, through declarations and resolutions and so on, into commitments in practice. So my question to you is, do you see any forward movement? Has this current situation made things just generally much worse, or is it possible to imagine new alliances that can push things forward more effectively? What are the prospects for our getting policies of gender equality, starting with women, peace and security, but also in other fields, that become tangible, that become really concrete?
Well, I would say that the positive thing is that many countries now speak about women, peace and security. They speak about sexual violence in conflicts. They speak about what we need to do, but there are too few who actually do it. So tomorrow in my speech in the Security Council, I will concentrate on three things. We need leadership, we need implementation, and we need accountability. Because it's not enough anymore just to say that we want women in peace negotiation, or we want women's perspective in the peace agreements, if you then don't act on it, if you then don't actually take women into the actual meeting room, into the actually peacekeeping operations, and if you're not held accountable for it. And that is the step where we are now. So I would say, yes, we have taken one step forward, meaning that more and more countries, actually I would say a majority of countries, now are accepting the notion of women in these issues. But we are so far behind when it comes to these implementation and accountability and leadership in it. And I must say that I'm so worried about this coalition that I spoke about. It's 19 countries who has joined this moral conservative coalition, invited by a letter of Mr. Pompeo. And as I said, Russia, United States and Saudi Arabia in the helmet.
Well, thank you for that. I mean, I think that we're all hoping for a powerful backlash to the backlash, as I think Secretary General Guterres called for. Let me just ask another question. Many of our students want to pursue careers in foreign policy, as you have. But they want to pursue careers in foreign policy, but they also want to promote feminist agendas. What would you give? What advice would you give them, if or when? I think it's not just a question of if, but when a colleague, a friendly colleague from their own country says to them, "Well, that's all very nice, but really our state's interests come first, and that may or may not concern gender equality."
Well, I think most of the state has 50% women. So if they say the state is in our interest, it must be all the women. So I actually don't see that there is any contradiction. I just see that we have to change the mindset in ourselves, because sometimes we think that, well, we are not part of the society, we are not part of the peacekeeping, we are not part of the peace building. And we don't see how stupid that is, frankly. So we need to change our mindset, and we need to change their mindset. And can I take one example from my former ministerial post as Minister of Trade? Because when I started first as a Minister of Trade, I said we need to speak about women and trade. And the first time I said it to the General Secretary of the WTO, he kind of laughed at me and said, "But trade has nothing to do with women." Okay, but I still think that we need to talk about women and trade. And then, actually in Argentina, a year later, everything was a fiasco. We couldn't agree on anything. So then there was a resolution that some of us that called ourselves the champions of equality, we had a resolution on gender and trade. And since nobody could agree upon anything else, everybody said, we can agree on this. And they didn't think about what it meant. So then when we had a trade foreign policy, I thought as a trade minister, but exactly what is a feminist trade policy? And we started to look all over, what is it? And we didn't find de-aggregated analysis. But then in the United States they had it. So we started to look into it. And then we saw things like, do you know that a silk blouse has 6 times as more tariff as a silk shirt for men? Do you know that sports clothes for women has 21% tariff and sport clothes for men has 7% tariff? Why is it like that? I don't know. Maybe I was part of the problem. I was Minister of Trade. I signed all those agreements. But it's also a question of life and death, because you have the same standards in trade agreements. And when you look at standards for cars, where is the seat belt, where is the airbag, those are made by a man when you test it in the car crash dummies, for example. So there's 47% more risk for a woman to get severely injured in a car crash than for a man. Because when you do all the tests, the dummies are made from a male body. So suddenly it was very concrete. Yes, there is a feminist trade policy as well.
Thank you very much. I think we'll open it up and then maybe I'll come back with some more questions. And yes, and I also would like to encourage students.
Movements have a tendency to degenerate. So we went from Marxism to Stalinism, for example. And the women's movement in the US have had this problem too, because they went from changing the game to joining the game. And from sisterhood is powerful to let's jump in the cockpit and go incinerate our sisters in the global south. And since militarism is the most virulent and vicious manifestation of male toxicity, how do you explain this movement and insistence on the right to do harm and the right to be wrong?
The United Nations is going to celebrate its 75th anniversary. And the purpose of the United Nations, as written in the Charter, is to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war. What are you prepared to say and do to raise the issue of war, of abolishing war as an institution? It has rules, it has laws, it has excuses in the Charter, and I'm not sure that we can pluck rape out of war and let the war go on. And you spoke about sexual violence during wartime. So I just wonder if you've thought about that. It's a feminist issue.
So I'm from Mexico, where we don't have a war in the traditional sense, but there's definitely a lack of peace that is very evident on gender-based violence and the very macho culture that we have. So my question is, what do you foresee the best track of foreign policy to impact those countries such as Mexico or Peru or Colombia or others that have such high levels of gender inequality? And what can we do as students, me and my fellow amazing cohort, to foster that foreign policy within our own country?
What you raise is very important, and most of the conflicts today are actually not between countries, but inside countries, with state actors and non-state actors. And I think that the question of women's participation and feminist is maybe even more important in those countries, because many times it's dominated by men and male violence. But the only thing to do is, of course, what Leymah is doing, is to organize, to activate, to speak up about what it is, and to do it together, and to get more and more on your side. And also not to be afraid of being ridiculed, I think, like I said with trade. They will always laugh at you in the beginning. And it was like Margot Wallström always said and there was a proverb that first they laugh at you, then they ridicule you, then they get angry at you, and then you win. And that is kind of, so I think there is no alternative. When it comes to what about to abolish war and the United Nations, well, the first thing everybody has to understand is that United Nations is not something up here, and then you have 193 member countries. The United Nations is no more than all the member countries. No more. So if you have a Security Council discussion, and they are the only one in the world who has the right given by all the member countries to decide upon peace and war, then if they say no, then you cannot do anything. Today I sat together with the Secretary General. We spoke for nearly an hour about Syria, Yemen and other issues, and talking about, for example, is there a possibility that the Security Council can decide that we need an international Security Council mandated international presence in the area between Turkey and Syria? You know, I shouldn't go into details, but you know. And the answer is, well, is all the Security Council members going to accept that? Probably not. And then UN cannot do anything, because UN is nothing more than the members. So first we have to get the members to accept it. Then UN can take decision, because nobody else can take decision. And this is very difficult, because we have, for example, from Sweden, together with many other countries, tried to get a veto-free culture in the Security Council. To take away the veto is not possible, because some of the country that has veto will veto it. So we understood that that was no part. But to try to get a veto-free culture, maybe that could be a step forward. But otherwise, I think that we have the countries and the leaders of the countries that we deserve in a way. So it's very difficult and very interesting to discuss how can we go more to decisions, not to make war, but make peace. And I'm very sorry, I didn't understand your question.
In the United States, we have this problem in the women's movement, where they insist that they should be in the military and in combat. I see that as a contradiction between the idea of feminism as a force for peace and becoming part of the this male toxicity militarism process, which is destroying the world. How do you explain a movement turning on itself?
Okay, I don't see as such feminism as a movement for peace. I see feminism as something that is changing the structures in a society, so that it's not an individual woman's fault, for example, when it comes to labor market, or when it comes to education, or when it comes to everything. It's a structural problem in a society, and that could be then used for good or for bad. I don't think, for example, that all feminists are pacifists. Some feminists are pacifists, some feminists are not. I come from a country where we are military non-aligned. We don't want to be members of NATO. But that also means, now you will not applaud, that also means that if I think that we need a defense, and we need it, we have a more aggressive Russia, and our neighbor, then we need to have our own defense. We don't want to be dependent on NATO. That means that we have to have a defense industry, and we need to export weapons. That would be contrary to what many pacifists would say. But I, as a very, very dedicated feminist, and I have been dedicated feminist for 40 years, since I was just in high school, I still believe that we should have a defense. I think that we need to export weapons, and I'm a very dedicated feminist. So what you put into contradiction, I don't say it's contradiction.
You spoke earlier about changing the mindset, and I've actually spoken to Professor Ergas about the backlash to the women's equality before. And one of my biggest questions is, how do we ensure that gender equality isn't totally dependent on institutions? Because we constantly see this back and forth, right? And it kind of turns equality into this charity that men provide women whenever they feel rich. And it makes me uncomfortable, because I don't want it to be something that is dependent on democracy or dependent on a strong judicial system. It should just kind of be there. So how in your mind, how do you go about changing the mindset so it's not dependent on political structures?
You have to change the political structure, because that is what change also mindsets. But you also have to change mindsets when you are in the political structures. Let me take one example. When in the beginning of the 90s, we fought very, very much in Sweden to get what you call separate list in all political assemblies. So it's a man and woman like this. And there was such a strong, very, very strong resistance. And it was used all the different arguments that the women don't want to be in political assemblies, we cannot find enough qualified women, blah, blah, blah. And then we decided to have it like that, that we should have in our party first, I'm a social democrat, that there was be no political list if they were not zebra, or maybe you call it zebra. And in the beginning it was a lot of resistance, and now, so many years later, nobody thinks of it. I mean, it's not on the political, nobody would say that we shouldn't have it anymore. And it's in all parties, the right-wing parties, the center parties, the social democratic parties, it's not an issue at all. And we have had, do you remember Justin Trudeau in Canada? He said he had 50-50 in the government in 2015. And they were so proud because they said, why do you have 50-50 in the government? And I said, well, because it's 2016. And I was in a panel with him, and they said, well, it's 2016. And everybody went, oh, hooray, hooray, you're so great. So I said, hello, hello. We started in 1994. And since then, every government, right wing, center, left, has always been 50-50. So I think if you just can make it work until it's not an issue anymore, then you have won a great deal. But that doesn't change what I said before. You have to change also the mindset of people, because we still have problems in Sweden, for example, to get many women into peacekeeping operation. I put a bill to the parliament last Thursday on a new mandate for, actually for our peace-building operation in Mali. We also have in Afghanistan, we have in Iraq. And we don't have enough women to take part in those. And we tried to do it, but we have failed. We don't have many women from a Swedish side. And we have feminist foreign policy, we have everything, and still we have not. So we also have in many areas a way to go.
If I could ask you a question, which is, Sweden is an extraordinarily impressive country. As you said, we've been doing it since 1994 and other things from way beyond. But it's also not a very big country. And I'm wondering, how is it that Sweden develops its Volkskraft, its ability to really make a mark on an international system that is so heavily dominated by some very big actors? It seems to me that actually Sweden has been forging a path. So, am I right? And could you talk about that?
We believe we have the best ideas many times, and we are not afraid to say it. and also, I think that when you are a country of 10 million, you really have to be good at building alliances. You really have to work together. I mean, if we, now on Wednesday, I will meet with we have 5 Nordic countries, and together we are 20 million people. And we work together many, many times. Sometimes we think differently. We are not a bloc, for example, in the EU, but many times we do things together. and then we have a much bigger weight. I always, as a Swedish Minister of Foreign Affairs, but also before as a Swedish Minister of European Affairs, I spent a lot of time trying to convince other countries. Sometimes I really tried to go into the bigger countries and to get them on our side. So like last week, they have the new foreign minister in Germany. So we met and I really tried to convince him on some of the issues that is important for us, because if you work together in alliances, you're much, much stronger than if you work alone. Maybe as Americans you don't have to think that way, but we, coming from smaller countries, absolutely have to think that way.
Do you see a risk that a feminist foreign policy and gender equality in general only is executed when it aligns with military and economic interests of a country? For example, the weapon export that you were talking about has been highly debated in Sweden, and I think that's a question of that, and I wonder how you see that and what risks that might imply.
Let's take those questions.
Hi, my name is Eva and I'm also from Sweden. So congratulations on your new post. As the Swedish Foreign Minister, you sort of become this world symbol for feminism, and feminism can be a very provocative word as you travel around the world talking to people. Just on a personal level, I'm just very curious, were you ever hesitant in accepting this, and what are your thoughts about being that person who stands up and constantly have to defend feminism? Thank you.
Well, the first question on if there is a contradiction between, is that what you meant, between?
If you will only implement a feminist foreign policy if it aligns with state and economic interests, but sometimes those might be conflicting. And when
no, we will, no, the answer is no. We will pursue the feminist foreign policy always, in all areas, but of course sometimes we can have different opinion what it is. Sometimes, for example, last week I gathered 35 different women organizations to discuss what do they think is the next step in the feminist foreign policy, what do they think we have done so far. We presented a formal communication to the Parliament on these 5 years with feminist foreign policies, and now all members of Parliament can have motions on it. And some of the women said exactly like you said, feminist foreign policy cannot accept weapon export, for example. And then I argue otherwise. Some said that you cannot have the migration policy as Sweden have if you have feminist foreign policy. I argued otherwise. So of course it's not a mold that you put on and said everybody has to follow exactly this. But what you have to do with a feminist foreign policy is to always ask yourself, and this goes for all our over 100 embassies and general consulate around the world, the three things I said, the rights, the representation, the resources for women. You should always have that in mind. But then of course you can debate what is exactly the right way to go. But the question is no to your answer. Then on a more personal, no, I wouldn't hesitate for 1 second to be a symbol of feminist foreign policy. I just think it's a great honor. I was greatly honored when the Prime Minister asked me, and I think that there would have been many politicians who also like me would feel like it's an honor to be a symbol for feminist foreign policy.